All right, still recording now. So I was
Just move
just
here and there. Yeah.
so I was just sharing about to anyone that's tuning in about this experience I had where I was feeling really agitated with an issue in my relationship, and and I was also feeling quite, I guess, physically tired, and I went and had a nap, and when I woke up, I wasn't tired anymore, and the whole issue was gone. And I mean, I explained it to my wife, and then she just said, "Well, that's what happens. People they go and they sleep on it." And but this seemed different than that. It was almost, it wasn't like, okay, I'm gonna sleep on it and I'm gonna see about reframing it or whatever. It was just gone. Like it just wasn't the whole how you know the angst around it, or even the conflict with it.
Yeah, like the feel, like when I heard you describe it, it almost sounded like resentment, right? Like, oh, you're asking me to do this.
Yeah, yeah, and so like I was gonna say before, so it kind of in the typical model is that there's a resentment there and it needs to be expressed. And if it's not, it's just going to bubble over and burst. And I mean, we do that. We do talk about things and clear the air, but this one, it just seemed out of the norm when I was experiencing it, and then that it just went away. Yeah. So then that was before I hit record now. I was asking
So
your thoughts
yeah,
on it.
I think it's as you pinpointed when you first told me about it too. It was probably related to fatigue because you go and have a nap and you wake up and it's not there anymore. Because
Mm-hmm.
so many of our emotional expressions are, I mean, I would guess that almost all of our emotional expressions are related to some physiological uh, outcome, imbalance, or like even when someone seemingly says something to us and we get triggered, that's still, it's a physiological reaction to a perceived threat. So we're always responding to something physiological, a lot of the emotional impulses that we experience.
Yeah.
That said, I think any meaning that is attached to them comes from attachment, in the sense that we're constantly trying to tell a story about why we're experiencing this emotion that we're having. Again, this is from my
Yeah.
previous experience, narration.
Yeah.
So you build a story around why I'm feeling this way. And it's actually the story that kind of reinforces it and I think creates those longer term issues. Like I need this resolved. I need to talk this through to understand why I felt that way. Whereas if you note it, it just comes up and you experience it. And you go, oh, I haven't eaten, or I'm tired, or I'm sore from working all day, or hey, I've been doing a lot, and I'm tired. And then you go and you have a nap and it's gone. I think that's pretty clear evidence that A, you're not hanging on to a story about it, that you just experienced it. And then it became like a trigger or a clue through to explore, oh, what is going on in me on the physiological level. And to me, that's just pretty clear linkage. And that's been my own experience in the shift from a very narrative based identity and hanging on. So because I had the emotion, I fixate on it and weave it into the story that I tell about myself, my circumstances. And then because I'm hanging on to it and fixated on it, it actually becomes, well, fixed and stronger over time because that's where my focus or attention is.
So I got a whole bunch of questions, but this is the first one that comes. So it's the usual way of okay, I'm going to sit down and talk to this person who I have the perceived the narrative is I have this conflict with this person. Is sitting down with them, does it, why it seems to sometimes resolve it is because it aligns with the narrative, right? So I have feelings and I have I should be treated in such a way, and this person, I've sat down and talked to them and they agree that yes, what they said, could have been mean or whatever, and they agree that they shouldn't hurt my feelings. So then it works, right? Because then I'm good. Because then the narrative is
The
that's
narrative's resolved. Yeah, and I
back
think
to a baseline or back to
yeah,
the
back to a baseline. And this is what, as you said that, this is what strikes me as so absurd about a lot of the, like, even mediation as a process. I think the real magic happens in surfacing the emotions underlying, and that's because people are hanging on to them and fixating on them, and that's what creates a pattern of conflict between them, or that dynamic, I imagine. And I think just in the surfacing and talking through it, that gives space to let it go, right? Because, oh, well, now that we're actually talking about this, I'm not hanging on to it in this one part of my body and letting it grow and feeding it with my attention, right? Or my focus, which in turn then like creates this kind of imbalance over time. It creates this stickiness to that feeling. So you don't want to let it go, but you don't want to experience it, but you are experiencing it constantly because you won't let it go and because you're focused on it.
so
And I'm guessing the narrative would tie that into the other, perceived party in the conflict, as if they're generating this emotion in you somehow.
right, they're generating the emotion and their acknowledgement of it is what allowed it to heal.
Or
But
even
me,
just sitting there and even just hearing it out, like
right,
even just giving the space to the other person to express it.
so
Now
not
they're
even
actually experiencing it more fully, but
Mhm.
it's like in its repressed form, right? Now it's more powerful because there's a narrative attached to it, because there's more meaning, right? As you contextualize it with narrative.
So if it gets allowed to get aired and doesn't get rebuked, is that a word?
Yeah, yeah.
Refuted or whatever, then we're able to let it go. But if it gets, well, no, that's not what happened, and basically their message is, well, you shouldn't be feeling that, and then and then you're not able to let it go because
That can happen, yes.
it wasn't. Well, I'm just trying to just looking at it through a different
Yeah, yeah,
lens, right?
yeah,
So if
yeah.
we look at through the lens of narrative, as we say, but if we look at through the other lens of um, that it's just this energy that is arisen in the body and just needs its natural course, right? And what are all of the things that can occur that allows it to have its natural course, but also the things that can occur that will block it from having its natural course.
Yeah, so in my own experience of I think like a lot of the emotions that I experienced when I was young as a high sensitive, for instance, were not immediately accepted necessarily by the family, right? They saw it as some kind of weakness. This was never said explicitly, but I heard other things, other narratives that would support that. But that emotions are kind of weak, right? And I grew up in the place where I grew up was reinforced that sort of perspective of it as well, right? And I definitely internalized a lot of that, right? Which over years became anger. And it was just all this kind of suppressed other emotion because I wasn't allowed to show it, or shouldn't show it, or I was shame. There was shame attached to expressing emotion, which creates a very dysfunctional long-term pattern. And again, it supercharges the emotion. So whatever is lying underneath, I'm no longer experiencing, say, the sadness or just some of the basic things that I wasn't supposed to share. Then that literally compounds into like anger. It's almost like an impacted emotion stuck in the body, creating all kind of havoc.
It's like diamond. It's like it just gets. It's a diamond.
Yeah, the diamond of focused anger, and yeah, and it's so the analogy I use to processing it when it comes up later, especially with the repressed emotion stuff, right? Because it's almost got a memory, right? In a sense, it's been held in the body for so long. So there's physiological rather attributes of clenching and holding on to things based on the different emotions, and in the process of releasing it, and this is what you pay the therapist to do, right? Is to sit and empathize basically with the story you're sharing, which is just giving air. And my analogy was it's like emotional compost. So you're there to sort of tell the story, but really what it's the story itself is surfacing the emotions that were not previously expressed.
The story is just the lubricant or the vehicle, or
Basically, it's how we may internalize it or memorize it, right? It's how we hang on to it. And then through the repetition of the story over years, you might not have the express emotion come up. You might get angry telling the story, right? Like it serves the story serves some kind of tool to hang on, and it's identifying that you're hanging on to something.
mm-hmm.
It's also noting it to you because, hey, you tell this story all the time, right? Or it's the same frame all the time. I'm the victim. And then in the process, again, of going through that therapeutic process where the paid therapist sits and listens as you literally turn your emotional soil, which gives it air, which actually makes it healthy as you're releasing it instead of shoving it down, right? But you have to almost break through that compacted or impacted layer, the diamond layer of emotion to give it air and to make it a healthy experience again. Or as you described it, just something that arises. It's just something arising in the moment. And the only meaning really is what I've attached to it.
And what about I guess I'm thinking of like I remember when I was going through that kind of therapy phase, and it just seemed like there was kind of a habitual,
Mm-hmm.
right? Here's this emotion, and I am expressing this emotion, and the story around it is, okay, now that's done. I'm not going to have to process that again. right? But then it comes again. And it's like, oh, here I am processing this again.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you ever experienced that.
That's why I use the analogy of compost, because you constantly turning compost, right?
Right.
And that's
But
where
there,
the repetition comes up, and the sense of being in a well-worn rut. Very familiar. Once you've already processed it, and then you're coming back to it. Oh, I know this feeling, this thing that's coming up.
right, but there's also kind of a sense that I thought I had worked on this, right? And here it is coming up again. And I guess I just wonder how much of it is just how our individual personalities process existing, and this is our way of being, or this is our way of interacting, and this is what arises from us. And so that just, again, it's kind of stepping out of the story that's attached to it, right? That where if you're in the story of it, it's like, oh, here's this, and this is about, I don't know, when I was 9 or whatever, right? And then if you step out of it, well, hang on, this is just what's coming up. This is, and what if it has nothing to do with anything else? And it's just in this moment,
And in
what's
fact,
arising?
it doesn't. Like when you put it that way, it really doesn't have anything to do with it. Like it's not happening.
The 9-year-old
Yeah.
when you were 9, right?
And that's what I mean by the encoding, almost like it's a form of memory, right? The story becomes a way of, it becomes like a landmark in your mind. Like it's really important, this thing that happened at that age. And the
Right.
story gives it a sense of being real, especially through repetition over time, right? Hey, who are you? Tell me about yourself. Oh, let me tell you. Let me tell you from the beginning,
What happened when I was 9?
right?
Right.
And it becomes an identity marker as well then, because now in my mind I've built up that narrative piece as being important to my identity. And really it could just be a signal that you had an uncomfortable emotion back then and it's sort of registered, right? You didn't know how to process it, so you didn't let it go, and now this is a signal that that's still there, and then you can go back and look at it and it's going to be okay.
Or what if it's just feels familiar,
And that's the yes, that's
and
the other
then
thing,
so then it's, oh, this, I remember feeling this way back then.
which
And
means that this thing is going to happen. Like the feelings and indications that the situation is going to happen or is happening the same way,
right,
like projecting it, right?
or that I haven't processed that and I need to work on that more, which
Yeah, so it starts with unawareness.
at 9 years old or whatever, is that what you mean?
Well, no, even in adulthood, when
Right.
like to see one's dysfunctional patterns, one has to experience the dysfunction first, right? And have all sorts of blowback effects to begin to recognize, like, oh,
Can you
consequences.
can you say that in a different way or give an example? I didn't know what.
What was I just saying? Oh.
Come on, it was so important and people were just hanging on to every word you're saying, Jeff.
Did I mention it doesn't matter?
This is just a story. This is all made up as well. Oh God.
What I was saying was, no, where it starts, right? You said 9-year-old. I said no, like in adulthood with the dysfunctional behavior that emerges out of, more often than not, this kind of narrative identity thing, right? I was a victim in this situation. Get into my adult life, and then I have reactions to encounters that remind me of when I felt in danger in my childhood, and these emotions arise that potentially are reminders of that too. And then I attach this extra significance to my situation that I'm in,
Mm-hmm.
as if it's the original thing that I've encoded into my story, like a memory, as if that is the thing that's happening. Um, and you start to get feedback on that, right? Hey, Jeff, ooh, I was just having a conversation with you, and it seems like you got really upset, like beyond, out of proportion to the situation. So you
This is like a
see,
very, very aware person that that you're having a conversation with. This is not the
hey,
this is
I
not the
want
typical.
to make an observation. If you're, yeah, right.
The typical is, well, fuck
My
you.
best friend that doesn't exist.
Yeah, like the you of 20 years from now.
So you get a nice to meet you, person of the future.
Yes.
No, but the feedback comes in all sorts of forms, not just the eternally insightful friend, but from, say, getting punched in the face, uh, say from abusing, hardcore drugs to escape that feeling. And when you start to see that pattern over time, when one is able to recognize that, which is not coincident, I think that's it's not coincidental that you see as many people in recovery as you do, because there's people that got very immediate feedback over a long period of time until they could not ignore it any longer and had to seek out an alternative, right?
Interesting. So you're saying like another way to describe someone hitting their bottom is very immediate, intense
Yeah, like you can't.
feedback, feedback from the
Uh,
world.
you've been trying to ignore this for a long time. It's like you're not capable of doing anything else now but seeing what's before you. Um, yeah, and I think that can start the journey then of beginning to recognize that, oh, I have shame about showing emotion. I had shame around this behavior, say, the drinking or drug abuse, or use, I should say. I had a lot of shame around that, so I hid it, right? That was another aspect of not acknowledging that something was troubling or upsetting. And on, that's where you start peeling back the layers. And the one that you taught me, what you were able to demonstrate to me though, was because I'd been doing all that basically narrative style work in the therapy, which I did find helpful. And that's like I mentioned that analogy about turning compost at the end. It was terrifying at first, and it wasn't something I wanted to repeat and keep doing. But the charge lessened in time as far as being with it and actually experiencing it, as opposed to trying to suppress it and ignore it. But getting on the other side of the narrative, when you just pulling at those narrative strings, showed me just how much of that identity was built up, into something what is like a living kind of memory, right? This by telling a story about it, about identity and who one is. The fascinating thing about stories is you can change them at will as well. You can pull out pieces and insert pieces to make it more dramatic, to make it more unbelievable and compelling. or entertaining. And I think we do that a lot over time by ourselves in the story that we tell about what our identity is too, right? To give off some sort of impression.
So as we're talking about this, and it's being recorded, it's kind of different than us just bouncing this off each other by ourselves. So what would you say to someone that's watching this and who feels that what we're talking about is just dismissing, is in some way dismissive of their pain, the trauma that they've undergone? Because I guess when you talk about the person that's healing, right? So that I think it seems that a very important, not first step, but a step in the healing process is recognizing it, right? And recognizing the trauma. And you and I have both kind of experienced that, and are talking about a different way to frame experience. But it can come across as being insensitive and dismissive. I mean, I don't know if you've had experience with that. It sounds like you have a lot of conversations with friends and people and stuff like that. And so what would you say to someone that expresses that?
I suppose the first thing I would acknowledge is that they have some memory of what they went through.
Mm-hmm.
And then the reason that I even bring up these things to talk about them was in my own experience to try to get out from under the weight of it. And I didn't know what it was that I was carrying. Having gone through the process of unburdening, I can say that there's nothing to minimize. It was an incredibly painful experience. It's an incredibly challenging experience.
Mm-hmm.
And it was terrifying too. I would add that it's not something I willingly engaged in necessarily. It was more like, I got to do this now. This is just, it's come up. So that's, again, I'm not putting my experience above anyone else's.
Yeah, I'm not
and I would,
saying that.
and to that person though, that it sounds like we're minimizing or dismissing it.
Mm-hmm.
Again, the reason I was just framing it in that manner was to say you're carrying around a lot of weight that you don't need to be carrying around, and that's not on you. It's not your fault. It's just that in the terms that I'm speaking and sharing with you as we explore these things together, we're just trying to come up with the best approximate language that we can, right? To share this experience and narrate this, articulate, I should say, this experience. And that's from our own experience.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, I guess I'm kind of speaking from experience of kind of getting that impression from people, right? Even so, the thesis that I'm working on, right, for my master's is about seeing through the story of the self, right, and seeing that, like, who kind of exploring that small sense of self that needs protection and needs to be that's so fragile, right? I mean, it is fragile. I mean, we're trying to hold this thing as permanent in a reality that's oozes with impermanence. But I get it's so, and this is what, it's so contrary, or in, I don't know how to, yeah, contrary, in some ways, maybe even in opposition to a lot of the current ways of therapy and healing, and it's seen as dismissive, as, right, that I don't know quite how to, anyways, it, you say.
I was going to say, so what you're attempting to articulate is the sense of resistance that you get from people when you suggest that, hey, maybe you're not that important after all.
Well, not even so much, well, that them, but to me, it's more the people that are doing the therapy,
Right.
right? That, well, you're really, you're
not honoring the story or perspective, the victimization, and the person's emotions around that, and the impact it's had on them.
right, and for some people, that's their lens of healing, is, and for them, this the the path is more about creating a healthy sense of self, right? And some, what I'm trying to uh, shine some light on is, like, is that even really necessary? Right? That, I mean, just to cut to the chase, it's, I think, to me, seeing through the sense of self and seeing will the results of that is a very healthy sense of self.
Yeah. Okay, and I would agree with that, like from my own experience.
Right.
But that said, you're also, you're dealing with a lot of people who have been, I'll use the word, they might bristle at this too, but indoctrinated into a certain view, a
Yeah.
therapeutic approach built
Trained.
on so much evidence over time. And so they come from traditions. And you're also speaking of, when you're speaking in the terms you're speaking of a very small group of people who have ever had any experience of that. Maybe, of what you're describing.
Shifting the view of the
Sense of
self.
self,
Right.
right?
Not
So,
to be fair, I think the people indoctrinated, from my experience, most of them have actually benefited personally from that model, right?
which is what people tend to gravitate towards, right? The thing that
Right.
works for them. Yeah.
Right. So this was really healing for me, and I want to now share it with others, which is my story to the core, right? And yeah.
Right. But your particular, it's basically anathema to their tradition.
What?
It's the antithesis of one of the underlying principle, underlying assumption. We can take this unhealthy self and make it into a much healthier self. And say, well, let's just see if there's a self. Oh, and
Right.
incidentally, you end up with a healthier self.
Right. Right. But if that hasn't been your experience, then, and your experience is that having a healthy self is much better than having a unhealthy self, then someone comes along and starts suggesting that maybe that self doesn't exist at all, and that maybe trying to make it healthy just reinforces the illusion.
Yeah, and that's
I don't know how we got down this whole.
you were asking about resistance to the message or minimizing, right? The story
Right.
that
Right.
people might perceive as minimizing their story.
Yes, because, and I've also, from people that practice other forms of psychological healing, that's kind of the impression I get from them, that I should be careful that I'm not minimizing their story.
Right. And which from their training is an appropriate analysis.
Mm-hmm.
But when you shift one of the underlying assumptions about what is healing and what is health and what is self, then that whole framework shifts, right? The whole understanding of it will shift as well. But so you're working against an orthodoxy, right? And very early on, because I think one of the challenges too of what you are exploring and what you're attempting to show, it's really hard to capture. It's probably the most ethereal of, like, statistically, to be able to capture some sense of it.
Yeah, unless you've experienced it, it makes,
It's very personal.
well, it makes absolutely no sense either, right? Unless you've, it's almost like this, I don't know, it's like if, I don't know what it's like. It's this, it's really, if you're talking, if your way of viewing the self is that it's this actual thing, right? That we have a solid self, then other ways of talking about it just kind of sound like gobbledygook.
Yeah. Like, keep in mind this debate. This is like has been raging in philosophy for how many thousands of years
Right.
about what self actually constitutes, right? Or what we actually know.
Yeah, and that's so interesting that hasn't crossed over to psychology.
Well, I mean, in a sense it did. If you look at the early practitioners,
How early?
well, I'm talking like the last 100 years, since people started toying around with the idea of psychology.
Yeah.
They were drawing from some things that have been discussed in philosophy, for sure. And the early practitioners, a lot of the founders of the different facets of psychology, they were kind of like, they were representative of a particular materialist view or immaterialist. So when you even look at Freud and Jung, what I say, you know, they had very similar conceptions, one having learned from the other about what lies underneath, kind of what drives a human. But I would say Jung definitely took a much sharper, he steered away from the more frightening aspects that Freud was really obsessed with and concerned with, and went into a lot of symbolism and you know, archetypes, and so almost more like on the spiritual side. It was like a spiritual reflection of what was possible in it. And then from those sort of foundational camps, if you will, then you have materialists like someone like Skinner, who's a behaviorist, right? So here's this machine, here's this human machine, and we can condition it to behave a certain way. Then you have the behaviorists. So there's this constant, almost like an ongoing discussion within the discipline itself. It's very interdisciplinary within the discipline itself, right? And all of that said, when you get to the point of say therapies, you have ones that are very much grounded in a materialist sort of orientation, and they're going to be using mechanical infrastructure and technology to beam, we're using a magnet to beam something into your mind to try to realign it because you're feeling depressed. So they're looking at a very physical sort of orientation to the underlying problem, or physiological. And then you have more on the talk therapy side, which is more spiritually oriented, I would say, though I don't think they were meaning based. And I think that underlies a lot of their assumptions in how they talk about things. And I know it does, how they talk about things and how they frame them and how they approach them. So you get things that are measurable and you get things that are not as measurable. And they tend to show up in the same discipline, right? And one will sort of take the lead for a while, saying, oh, see, obviously this is the way things are. And then they'll fall out of fashion within a decade. And go, oh, look at all the underlying assumptions of that one. See, they were wrong, but maybe not totally wrong. So, and then you get a reformulation of it again.
Yeah.
So I would say those ideas they are represented in the field of study. And one of the primary problems with psychology itself is that it's difficult to replicate studies, and it's even the design of them. The biggest struggle they have is they're trying to emulate as closely as they can the scientific process, but you can't measure immaterial things the same way you can material things. So they'll always fall short on that front, and they will forever have insecurity about not being a true science.
All right, we won't go down.
Result.
We won't go down that rabbit hole. All right, I think I'm just gonna. Is there anything more you want to say about
No.
that process?
No.
I think we'll just stop it. And